Okay, so chapter 22, immunity. So really, immunity is protecting against infectious agents, against damage, cancer, things like that that can damage us. Now, pathogens are things that can cause that, generates illness or disease. Now, the infectious agents that do this are usually microorganisms, but really they don't have to be microorganisms. So the major categories are bacteria, which are a prokaryotic organism, viruses, which are a little piece of DNA with with a protein coat, fungi, which is a whole kingdom that includes yeasts and molds and up to mushrooms, protozoans, which are eukaryotic single-cell organisms, and multicellular parasites. And we can throw in prions as well. They're just a very rare thing. It's what causes mad cow disease. So bacteria, single-cell prokaryotic. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have organelles for the most part. They are small. They have a membrane, cellular membrane, fluid mosaic, phospholipid bilayer. Some of them are spherical. Some of them are rod-shaped. Some of them are corkscrew shaped. So the spirilla are corkscrew, so that would be things like Lyme disease and syphilis. Rod-like bacillus, they're called bacilli, so lactobacillus are rod-like shaped. Spherical are cocci. So if there's a bunch of spheres in a row, like in a stripe, they're streptococci. If the cocci are in a little group, it's staphylococci, like as staph as a group. Yeah, and so cocci are like little spheres, like little pills almost. So there are more bacteria species, and in numbers of individuals and in numbers of species, it's incredible. The vast majority of bacteria really don't affect us very much. They ignore us, we ignore them. A lot of bacteria are very, very useful to us. Bacteria that live in our intestines can create vitamin K for us. They do all kinds of things. We need bacteria. We need bacteria in our environment. Very few of them are virulent, that can cause, that are pathogens. Viruses, little pieces of DNA or RNA in a protein shell. There's a debate whether they're even living, but because they have DNA, does that make them alive? They don't have any organelles, they don't have cell membranes, they're not cellular. They can't reproduce on their own. They have to hijack the translation and transcription processes, protein synthesis processes of a host cell. So they move into a host cell and they take it over. So they basically are parasitic to an individual cell. There are lots of viruses that don't affect us. Most viruses have a specific cell type that they like, that they go into, and that really, they gain entry through receptors. So like the SARS coronavirus that is now causing COVID gets in, I believe, through the angiotensin converting enzyme receptor. And there's a lot of those in the lungs, and there's fewer of those in other places, and that's why it primarily affects the lungs. A lot of viral diseases. Fungi are eukaryotic. They're a different kingdom. They're not plant. They're not animal. This is molds, yeasts, mushrooms. They tend to, because they release proteolytic enzymes, they tend to cause inflammation. So athlete's foot, ringworm, vaginal yeast infections, that kind of things. In the lungs, histoplasmosis from breathing in molds, they can occupy that. They can actually circulate in the blood. Candidiasis and candida would be an example of that. Protozoans are eukaryotic cells. They are parasitic. Malaria is a protozoan. Beaver fever, so Giardia is protozoan. Amoebic dysentery is caused by an amoeba, which is a protozoan. Trichomonas is protozoan. And then we can have multicellular, so worms, tapeworms, liver flukes, that kind of thing, are multicellular parasites, and they can cause infections as well. I mentioned prions. These are infectious proteins. They're not cells. They're not viruses. They are just abnormally folded proteins that seem to be able to reproduce themselves. So they cause neurological issues, mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, Kuru. What's frightening about them is they're not killed by cooking temperature, and because they're not alive, they're not affected by cooking temperatures, and they can infect the neurological systems of people or animals that ingest them. I'll leave it at that. So there are cells involved with immunity. So the leukocytes are white blood cells. And we've already talked about them. There are the granulocytes, which are the ones named Phil, neutrophil, eosinophil, and basophil. There's the monocytes that become macrophages, and there's the lymphocytes. And lymphocytes can become B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, or natural killer cells. We'll talk about them more in the next videos. They are all involved with protection of us. They're all involved with immunity, either specific or non-specific immunities. I brought it up in the last video, but lymphatic tissue is reticular connective tissue, and they really house. So this is spaces within the body tissues with open space that house these lymphocytes and these macrophages. So it gives them room to work. And we call these structures secondary structures. The primary structures are the bone marrow that give rise to these cells, and the thymus, which makes them immunocompetent. And we'll just kind of leave that at that. We tend to find a lot of this stuff at the borders. Like, if you want to deal with an invasion of your country, you probably want to set up camp close to the border instead of in the middle of the country. So we have a lot of this stuff close to the skin and the mucosal membranes, where the outside meets the inside. There are things called mast cells that are found in most connective tissues, and they're involved with inflammation. We'll get to that later. So the immune cells are found all over the place. Okay, another thing that we need to know about are things called cytokines, and these are small proteins that regulate the immune activity. They're chemical messengers that go from one cell and they bind to receptors of a target cell. they can be they can act on themselves, so the cell will release these transmitters, these messengers, to work right on the cell itself. That would be called autocrine. If they just work on the cells surrounding them, they're paracrine. If they're distant, they're called endocrine hormones. They don't last for very long because if they did, then they would constantly be stimulating a reaction. So they are released, they bind to the receptor, they cause the effect, then they're removed. And so what do? They control reproduction of these cells. So a cytokine will cause the production of more macrophages, for instance. They are involved with regulating the inflammatory response. They are also involved with cellular death, with killing cells that have something wrong with them or have outlasted their usefulness. So in the next video, we're going to pick up at looking at innate and adaptive immunity.